Welcome. Thank you for attending today's webinar hosted by the Organization Development and Change and Workforce Education and Development Program at Penn State. Today, we have the great pleasure of welcoming our presenters, Dr. Wesley Donahue and Dr. Eric Bergstrom and David Walker. My name is Jenny Lee, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Workforce Education and Development Program. We also have Sagun Giri with us today, who will be managing chat feature and Q&A session. In terms of the interactive format for this webinar, please open the chat feature in the Zoom platform to interact. If you have any questions about the presentation, please use Q&A feature on Zoom. We can see the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Click the Q&A button and write your questions. The Q&A session will be at the end of the presentation. Our online Master of Professionals studies in Organization Development and Change can help you prepare to implement quality and continuous improvement initiatives in an organization. Furthermore, there is a PhD program in Workforce Education and Development with a concentration in Human Resource Development and Organization Development. Our program has created a continuous monthly webinar series with experts around the world. Today, we welcome Dr. Donahue and Dr. Bergstrom and David Walker. Dr. Wesley Donahue is the coordinator of the online Master of Professional Studies in Organization Development and Change and an instructor of related courses and programs. An experienced researcher, developer, and leadership consultant, he has an extensive manufacturing, engineering, sales, and management background, having started and operated businesses for more than 30 years. Dr. Donahue is a registered professional engineer, Six Sigma Black Belt, and author of education and training materials, including the books Building Leadership Competence and Unlocking Lean Six Sigma. We have another co-presenters, Dr. Eric Bergstrom. He has taught undergraduate credit and non-credit business management courses, as well as graduate training and development and organizational development courses. He has facilitated leadership development programs for organizations across a variety of industries focused on strategic planning processes, continuous improvement processes, human resource development, and organization development. His practical and research interests include individual career development, leadership competency modeling and development, human resource development, and organizational process improvement. And we have David Walker as another co-presenter. David completed his MPS in the Psychology of Leadership program at Penn State in 2020. He oversees multiple industrial explosive manufacturing operations across North America. David has been a driver in multiple large-scale global lean manufacturing implementations over the last 25 years. Here are Dr. Donahue, Bergstrom, and Walker.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you for the great introductions, and also welcome to everybody who could join us today. We're happy to have you here, and a few things we would like you to kind of take away from the program once we're done. We would like it to be able to differentiate organization development from organizational development, AL. It seems like they might be the same, but we'll test your knowledge on that a little bit. Also provide an understanding of Lean as a methodology, Six Sigma as a methodology, Lean Sigma, which is kind of the blurring of the two, and I'll also try to demystify the belts, the yellow belt, green belt, black belt, and so forth. With that, I'd like to get you to start thinking about what are process improvement projects that could potentially benefit your organization, and then share with you some case studies of Lean Sigma project initiatives. Dave has extensive experience in that area, and we'll share 3 case studies that he's been involved with. And hopefully we'll answer questions along the way. So if you have questions or whatever, you can put them in the chat, and we'll field those questions at the end, and so forth. So from that, those are some of the outcomes. And let's just get started with differentiating organization development from organizational development. And you can poll yourself here a little bit. Do you know the difference? Is there a difference, or don't you know? And this is something that we're really keen on, particularly for our program, because our degree program is organization development versus organizational development, the AL. So what's the difference? I mean, it's a little semantics maybe. Well, to us, there's really a big difference. And the difference is organizational with the AL really takes a top-down approach to changing organizations. So you think about the traditional organizational structure of a company, and you look at trying to initiate change efforts, and you think about that top-down structure. Who are people really trying to satisfy there? You think about that. Who are people in the organization trying to satisfy? Well, in contrast, we look at organization development, which takes a bottom-up humanistic approach to changing organizations. And if you think about a bottoms-up, that's quite a difference. That means you're really asking the frontline people what they think about particular jobs and so forth. And kind of an analogy to maybe bring this home, and a difference philosophically between these two words and our program is, for an organizational development approach, analogy might be a medical doctor. You go to a medical doctor, you tell them your symptoms, they look you over, they write your prescription, you're on your way. That's organizational development. And I think in that approach, many times employees there are trying to satisfy and make their boss happy, versus the bottoms up approach, which is really more of a clinical psychologist approach to change. And you think about that, a clinical psychologist, instead of telling you what you're going to do, would be, and being the expert, would be asking you, hey, you want to go from A to B? Well, what makes you think you're at A? How about B, C, or D? So this philosophical approach to change is quite dramatic when you think about it. And how that plays itself out, if you imagine if you flip that organizational chart upside down and place the customers at the top, and you think about how that would change the dynamics of any organization, where everybody is really there to serve customers and improve their processes in the best way they can. And of course, that focus is really then the focus of organization development. Organization development is all about small group, large group facilitation, and so forth, and really humble leadership. If you look at here, the job of the senior leaders is to help the people that work for them, not the other way around. So in looking at this and how it plays out with Lean Sigma, you can see where maybe serving customers and improving processes might take on a little new meaning. But before we get too far along with that, there's one gentleman that you may or may not have heard his name before, Edward Deming. He's known as the father of quality. And you can see his quote here: if you can't describe what you're doing as a process, you don't know what you're doing. So how this plays out with organization development and so forth, I'm going to turn this over to Eric to give us a little lesson in lessons of the past that some of us have learned. Okay, Eric?
Thank you, Wes. Well, they are lessons of the past. Dr. Deming and one of his colleagues, Duran, were very involved in helping transition the Japanese after World War II into an industrial competitive force. And many of us, Wes, David, and I, probably walked along the path that they started back in, they started in 45, but in the early 80s, we started seeing the transition of how we do change in the business community as started and as initiated by Deming and Duran. And not to be outdone by the folks in quality, there were people that on the social science side, the organization development side, namely Eric Trist, who started the Tavistock Institute and was credited for creating the term and creating the concept organization development in the early, probably in the early 80s is when we saw it happening here in the United States. So you have in 1945, you have two parallel paths. One is organizational development, as shown by Deming and Duran, and that is trying to have the organizations develop and change. And then you had organization development by Eric Trist and the Tavistock Institute and people like that. And they were both walking along, developing their methodologies and their approaches through the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s up into the 80s. Now, when Wes and I were in business and industry back in the late 70s and early 80s, it was a top-down environment. The boss knew best, and that's the way things were done. And around 1982, the Japanese started doing what the Americans saw as quality circles, as a way to improve their quality. And all of a sudden, you had all these executives hopping on airplanes and flying over to Japan to see what the Japanese were doing to achieve such high quality. And at the same time, we had people that were doing the same thing in the social science side, looking at how do we engage people in helping to run the business. So you had the OD side of things, the Eric Trist, the Tavistock, the socio-technical systems, as a way of changing the culture and the way we go about business. And they had the folks that were from a quality standpoint trying to do the same thing. United States achieving quality through engagement of people. Both of them had common themes, engagement of people. So on the slide you see, we really start out with frustration with our lack of change to and involvement with the current state. We had poor quality. We were just making things and getting things done. It was a production push. And we also had a frustration on the part of employees in that they could see better ways of doing things, but weren't involved in the process. That required changes in roles and approaches to leadership. That goes back to Deming's comment. So we had the engagement and participation of organization members at all levels as we started getting into quality circles and socio-technical systems and things of that nature. And we also recognized that to achieve the change that we needed to have in the United States, we had to do that with and through people, which is really the OD side. So you saw kind of the change going from the organizational development top down to the organization development tapping the bottom up. And that's what you saw happening in the 80s. I remember sitting in an ASTD, that's the forerunner of ATD, an ASTD meeting in 1986, 87, where an individual from Motorola came in and said, we have this new thing called Lean Sigma or Six Sigma. And it's where we're trying to go and get and achieve zero defect. And so you saw the Lean coming out of Toyota in the early 80s. You saw the Six Sigma coming out of Motorola. So that's Lean Sigma. And you saw on the HR side of things, an emerging field called OD. And all these things were coming into the organizations from different approaches, different professions, different functions, the quality function, the HR function, the management function. And all those were looking at creating what we see in terms of organization change, a different culture that was not top down, it was bottom up, or it was collaborative decision making. And so we can go to the next slide. And so you go into the 1990s, and all of a sudden you see a team approach that was used in many, many organizations. You see a downsizing of levels and layers of management because we were empowering more people to make decisions that in the past were being made by supervisors and managers. We were training people, training employees at all levels to use, the same tools, structured problem solving tools, force field analysis tools, visual management tools, using team approaches. And the whole idea of the OD socio-technical systems was to have employees at all levels helping to run the business as opposed to a top down. At the same time, you had lean processes being developed in organizations, and you saw Toyota, specifically Georgetown, Kentucky, and you see a number of the books that were written by people that were watching what was going on. David Leiker and Mike Hoseas have written many books, or a number of books on the lean manufacturing as practiced in Georgetown, Kentucky, and Toyota. And they saw long-term results from that. And so what we saw there was common approaches used both in organization development, working with people, the training of people in these approaches, and the improvement of business results. And so you'll see things like using the tools to make those approaches. And then the reliance on organization members to engage in the change process. We gave the opportunity, we opened up the floodgates to allow employees at all levels to participate in running the business. It's kind of timely that AQP has their magazine that just came out this month, July, and it's Words of Wisdom. What do the quality practitioners have to say about, after 75 years of what we've learned in the quality process? And it's interesting to see that those things that the experts have said they've learned are the same things that we've heard from OD practitioners and that we teach across our courses in the Penn State Masters in Professional Studies and Organization Development and Change. And these things that you will see in this month's issue are things like, in a quality profession, what are some of the key competencies? Well, to ask great questions, to read constantly, to that everything belongs or begins with people, to value the involvement and the practice of engaging people, and emotional intelligence. It's critical competency that practitioners, whether they're OD practitioners or Lean Sigma practitioners, develop and possess high levels of emotional intelligence. And then they also talk a little bit about career coaching, the ongoing need to partner with and become part of a community, whether it's an OD community or whether it's a Lean Sigma community, to continue to learn and to be mentored by professionals that have preceded you on the path of either OD or quality. And then finally, some of the common tools, the teamwork, the Pareto charts, the emotional intelligence, those things. So what common themes have surfaced? Well, it's common themes of respecting people at all levels of the organization, engaging them in the change process, having managers and supervisors act as coaches as opposed to key decision makers, and to continuously develop and learn specifically in team environments. And so those are things that we've learned by looking at these parallel developments in both OD and in quality through the years from 1945 up to present and continuing forward.
And we're realists here. A lot of this is the way we would like it to be. For those of you in business and industry, you know that's not always the way it is. Obviously, for an OD approach to work, to have people engaged, it does take senior leadership support. But it takes senior leaderships who value engagement and who really believe that two heads are better than one, and that on average consensus decision making will on average make a better decision. So that's something that not all organizations have, unfortunately. And you see a lot of trauma and so forth that goes on. And it's one of the reasons why 70% plus of all change efforts fail. You think about that. And why do they fail? You know, do they have the right people involved in them? Well, one of the things that Deming did when he went to, of course, American industry at the time wouldn't listen to Deming. He was a mathematician here in the US. but a company over in Japan says, come on over and tell us what you're talking about. And of course, you had Toyota, the lean process, the fact that how they make their changes and so forth was born out of what Deming was teaching. Japan's National Quality Award is called the Deming Prize. Isn't that interesting? It's named after an American. So one of the things we start thinking about is if you did want to improve processes, you know, in your organization, what could or what should be improved? And start thinking about it. And if you really wanted to do it, who would you ask? Who would you engage? Well, it makes common sense, at least to me, that you would ask people doing the job. You know, the legendary Jack Welch, you know, even though, you know, he was actually a chemical engineer, but what made him different and what made GE successful for over 20 years was really Jack Welch took an OD approach to change. He asked people doing the job for better ways. He tried to get rid of the bureaucracy that stood in the way. And basically, you know, if there were decisions to be made like who should buy machine tools, he would never have engineers decide those kind of things. He had the machinists decide those. So the town halls and so forth, back in the time, a lot of companies tried to copy what Jack Welch was doing. But it isn't rocket science. It's just pure, simple, basic human, treating people the way you want to be treated. So if you're looking at your own organization, you know, how about the people doing the job? Don't be afraid to ask them. And of course, you start thinking, well, is an OD approach appropriate? Well, we would contend that it is. And start thinking about your own organization. What, you know, or has your organization improved or transformed any business processes? You know, that's a question you really start thinking about. What mistakes have they made? How would you do it differently? And I'll give you, a few minutes. You can write that, any ideas you have in the chat, that things you have done. A couple examples here at Penn State. One I'll call it a poor example. We implemented Canvas a few years ago. And when we implemented Canvas, it was a top-down organizational development approach. And as a result, it was here. We're starting Canvas come January. And of course, all the instructors, really, it was a new process, a new platform for them. Well, they had to be quick studies and learn how to do it. Well, when it came to the students, you know, there's a lot of dissatisfaction the first semester or two, because obviously the instructors weren't up to speed on Canvas the way they should have been. And as a result, when it came to the student ratings, a lot of the instructors took it on the chin. They didn't get such good ratings because of that, I'll say, lack of attention to that change effort. In contrast, the university is now implementing what they call, well, actually it's SAP, an enterprise IT system. And of course, we have to give it a cat name, so we call it Simba. But in this case, we're doing a little differently. We actually set up an OD department within business and financial services to help with that major change initiative, because it will take the place of many legacy systems. And I have to applaud the group for the effort they're doing, because I think they're doing it the right way. They're going one group at a time and taking it a little methodically in how they do it. But when you start thinking of your own initiatives, what are they? What could you be done? And if you look at any organization, there's lots and lots of different processes for improving. You know, some of them are just minor things to measure transformational changes. You think about every organization, you know, you're completing travel expense forms. Well, is it a streamlined process, or is it very bureaucratic? Preparing presentations, making them. You think about that. Preparing the financial statements. I mentioned the big enterprise SAP project Penn State has now. Basically, all those systems will be to create Penn State financial systems. Recruiting jobs, onboarding. How do you do it? What are your processes? Are they streamlined? Or I would suspect that all of you in one fashion or another do some kind of standard methods and procedures reviews or audits of your organizations. What works, what doesn't. So be thinking about in your own organization how you could apply Lean Sigma. What is it? Where are the processes and so forth? Where are the pain points? What keeps people awake at night? But then it gets into the actual methodologies of how to change. And this is where, let me take a few minutes and talk about Lean, Six Sigma, the difference and so forth. As Eric mentioned, we've been around a long time. We started, and as Dave too, we were chatting earlier, back when quality circles was the big thing. Then it evolved into TQM, Total Quality Management. And of course, then Lean, Six Sigma. And you wonder, well, are they flavors of the month? Well, you start thinking of what they mean. Well, Lean utilizes a project leadership approach from Toyota, and their focus is reduction of waste. And versus Six Sigma, which is collection of data and perfecting processes. But the Toyota process of waste, you have to think, well, where is waste in your organization? How about all the underutilized intellect? How many times have you been asked for your opinion? Bottoms up. You know, I'm in the position I am now because I was bought and sold in private industry. It wasn't any fun. I worked 16 years for a company. When we were taken over, not one person in the new company asked me what I did for the past 16 years. It was certainly not an organizational or organization development approach to a merger and acquisition. Underutilized intellect, wait time. How long does it take to get something approved? I'd be remiss if or probably I won't even tell you how long it took for us to get our online MPS degree approved through bureaucracy. Excess motion, processing, over-processing, unnecessary input, transportation, work scrap. All these things are just different kinds of things that are the focus of Lean. So Lean is reduction of waste. And it's basically a simple process. And if you want to look more into it, we can talk more about it at another time, but it's a very simple problem-solving process, of which you get the people on the line, frontline workers, engaged in it. In contrast, Six Sigma is really a statistical approach. Eric mentioned the term was coined by Motorola, but really Motorola was focused on reducing defects in their manufacturing process. So they go from 1 Sigma, 2 Sigma, 3 Sigma, so forth to Six Sigma. And you can see over to the right-hand side, the bell-shaped curve, Six Sigma is 99.99% defect-free. Well, do you need that kind of defect-free initiatives? Some places, maybe yes. My experience, though, is for most organizations, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that they don't need to be Six Sigma quality. But it is something to aspire to. And you can all probably remember, maybe some of you anyway, back the old bell-shaped curves of grading when so many people got A's, so many people got C's, and so many people got C's. Well, I think this whole bell-shaped curve is probably a little skewed now with grade inflation, but I think you get the gist that Motorola and Six Sigma is just statistics. It's nothing really new. It's just repackaged in a format that's really easier to use initially with manufacturing, but it's made its way into healthcare and other industries as well.
Yeah, Wes, if I could just really quickly here, this was really brought to light for me in 2 words by a Honda quality executive after an internal audit. And after they looked at our processes, and it was amazing what that team could pull out with a short Gemba walk or walk through the factory. So as we had the closing meeting, this senior quality executive from Honda. You know, he closes his eyes in the Japanese fashion and thinks deeply, and then he says, "Good enough." And so those two words really cemented for me what level of quality you need to have for which process. Is it good enough for what you're doing? Some things you need Six Sigma. Other things, 2 Sigma might be fine. 3 Sigma might be fine. So what is good enough? Back to you, Wes.
And what we've tried to do is, in our operational excellence certificate, where we have Teach Lean Sigma, we've kind of blurred the two concepts together, because it's really the tools. Whether the names are faddish, the tools will never go away. They're tools of continuous improvement and things that really practitioners at every level ought to have an appreciation for them. So, I'll encourage you to think about what's applicable, what kind of projects you might want to improve in your organization, and then how you might be able to pull in the tools to help you do it. That gets us a little bit into the belts, though. You can hear a lot about belts, Lean Sigma, Hydra. It's really a hybrid continuous improvement process. But when you look at the belts, again, Motorola started the belts with their Six Sigma, and it really caught on. You had senior level champions who were the people who leading the charge. You had master black belts that led black belts. Black belts were the ones heading up the projects. Green belts is really where a lot of the action is. These are the people in teams working in organizations. And then the yellow belts, it's being familiar with the process and being able to spot where opportunities might be. To give you an example, we did a program for a very large organization. If I told you its name, you'd know. That at the time had over 2,000 employees, and they wanted everybody trained in Six Sigma at the time. But if you looked at how many people were in each of these categories, there was a handful of champions, a couple dozen black belts, master black belts. Over 1,000, though, were in green belts. That's where the action is. You want people familiar with the activities and so forth. But when it comes to certifications, there is no, I'll repeat, there is no universally accepted black belt certification or green belt certification around. It's not like a licensure where you have a professional engineer or accountant, where you have state regulation, or it's not like you have a strong association like the Project Management Institute or the Architectural Institute having their own system in place that's everybody embraces. In this case, Motorola started with their black belts. Other corporations copied it. They may have changed the name. And it did take on kind of a common meaning. Both Dave and I went through black belt training at what was then Allied Signals, now Honeywell. And a black belt at the time was a month worth of training. For me, it was spread out over, it was spread out over 4 weeks over a number of different places. And then you had to do a project. In the black belt class I took at Allied Signal, there was 54 people in the class, and there was $32 million worth of projects. You had to have a project to come to the class. So the black belts themselves, the designation, some people will say, hey, you get a black belt, pay your $99, and you get one online. Well, you get what you pay for. But my point here is there is no one set universally accepted certifying agent for black belts, yellow belts, green belts, and so forth. So that gets us into then some of the case examples. And Dave, why don't you share here some of your observations?
Yeah, thanks, Wes and Eric. I appreciate the opportunity. I've been in this space for a while. I had the opportunity to be trained as part of a Toyota supplier development program back in the 90s. I was exposed to lean practices back in the late 80s, and have been in that space ever since in different manufacturing environments. So just sharing a few case studies here. 3 in my career. The first one, a good sized organization in the automotive space, about $8 billion a year, and then went to a large multinational, large conglomerate organization. Was there for a good 6 years or so. I was at the first one for 13, and then 9 years in the industrial explosives industry. And so it was very different, taking that mindset from the automotive space, where it's a right to play. If you don't have your lean skill set or Lean Six Sigma skill set in the automotive space, you might as well just take your name off the list. But in the industrial explosives and extraction space and fertilizer space, that's a completely different world that is coming up to speed here. So if we go to the next slide there. So organization 1, again, had that opportunity to be orchestrated with a Japanese expert as a part of a supplier development program. And they used a process, as we talk about organization development versus organizational development. One of the things we learned very early on in this process was a word called nemawashi, or to prepare the soil. That was one of the very first things that we learned in this process, and it was really taught heavily, that if we didn't prepare the soil, the change was not going to stick. The tree wouldn't grow. And so that's where I kind of put the organization development piece is, if we're not preparing that soil, which is oftentimes middle management, upper management, leadership, if we're not preparing that level to own the system of change, then the change isn't going to happen. That bottom-up approach isn't going to work if the roots don't have any nutrition or anywhere to go. And so that was very prominent in that specific case. Again, the primary focus was on those top and mid-level leaders, not from a top-down approach, but from a change leadership approach. How do we enable everybody in the organization to be participative and make sure that they've got a place where their voice and their changes could be heard and acted upon, and they would have the engagement or the autonomy to act upon their own ideas. So again, all functions were engaged, understanding that it's an end-to-end system. You can't improve manufacturing without improving supply chain, without improving procurement, without improving HR. It's a holistic system. It's kind of like, well, I'm gonna strengthen my biceps, but I'm not going to do anything about my heart and my lungs and my legs, and it just all doesn't work, right? It's got to work together. It was a localized implementation, meaning it wasn't a corporate top-down. It was focused on 5 plants in a specific area, and it was very high touch from that Japanese expert or sensei. So the expert taught the leaders, and the expectation was that the leaders would teach the organization. And I did have the experience I was actually, when this started, I was a team leader over a few production lines. And I had the experience of having the sensei come out, and with the leadership, they were asking questions, and the sensei would turn to the leader and said, why are you a bad manager? This process isn't working correctly. But never approached me as a first level team leader in the organization at that time, because he knew it wasn't I didn't create the system. I was working inside the system that was created. So that was some really important lessons that came out of it. So accountability, like I mentioned, was assigned to those leaders. It was focused on learning by doing. We did a little training and a lot of doing with that training. Interestingly, there wasn't a specific OD element highlighted, but now in retrospect, a couple of decades later, as I look back on it, I can see where those aspects were embedded in that process. So that's organization one. Organization two, if you'll flip the slide there, thank you. Organization two is, again, large company, internally developed process. They look to systematize it. And what I see a lot of organizations do is they see an outcome that they want, and they say, how did you get the outcome? But the question that's not asked is, how did your culture drive that outcome? And that's often the missing link. We want the outcome, but does our culture actually support that outcome? We can do things differently, but does it get us what we want long term? So there were all the great corporate things: plans, timelines, deliverables, expectation. It was a huge multi-site implementation, corporate driven, very manufacturing focused. Let's get the waste out of the cost of materials and the cost to produce and the labor, labor content. Yeah, how many can we reduce our labor? Number of heads is what that equates to. Very outcome driven. It was driven by trainers, facilitators, and specialists. So those were the boots on the ground, and there were different certification levels for that. They did actually have a specific OD facilitation element to it. So it was engineered or designed in, and there were some cases where it worked extremely well. And I shared one of those cases with Eric as we were in class. I was in his class a year ago as a part of that case study. So there were some elements that worked out quite well in there. Let's look at organization three quickly. So organization three, it was a consultancy developed, systematized, structured approach. So we basically bought externally an approach that was designed very similar: times, plan, lands, large scale, corporate driven. Early on, we looked across all functions, but that kind of narrowed right down to manufacturing pretty quickly. We can get bang for buck right here. And that's what it narrowed down to. Within a year, 2 years, it had narrowed down to primarily manufacturing and had been abandoned elsewhere. The activity was really focused on those lower levels in the organization, and at senior levels, we were primarily reporting outcomes, reporting progress, reporting cost savings. Very similar trainer facilitator approach. We did have a maturity score based on an assessment process, a standardized assessment process. There was some OD attention into the leading and managing change elements, but not as wide as I'd been exposed to in other environments. So with those, let's take a look at the next slide. What were the outcomes? Well, Organization one still maintains today a world-class status of continuous improvement. It's a tier one supplier, so you're not going to know the brand name across the board. It's not a car company. Tier one supplier. You never hear of tier one suppliers. You always hear of they don't get to take the limelight. But in the automotive world, they're known very well, and in the lean world, they're known very well. And that actually continued through multiple senior executive changes: CEOs, presidents, senior leaders across the organization, acquisitions, and along the way. So it took about 9 years from what I call full maturity, where basically it was an autonomous system where it would be harder to extract than it would be to keep in. Organization two sustained that implementation for about 7 to 8 years. Once there was a CEO change within a year or so, it had really gone back to, hey, we're rebranding this, we're changing it to a cost savings approach, almost back to the traditional Six Sigma methodology cost savings approach. Most of those resources were terminated or redeployed. And then in the third application, very similar as number two, about 7 years, CEO change, shifted, terminated, redeployed. So I think there's some lessons to be learned in these anecdotal observations here. Development and accountability at senior levels versus lower levels, I can see plays a big role in that? You know, what's the relationship to longevity of the initiative? How does it become the culture? And then, you know, the structured approaches were really intended to accelerate those implementations, but transitioned away. Why was that the case? I think I alluded a little bit to that, where companies tend to want to get the results of other successful companies, but not necessarily dig into what was the cultural driver behind that, and how is their culture helpful or unhelpful in that. And that's an area where organization development plays a significant role, is understanding that cultural piece and that change leadership piece. And then I think there's really some opportunity here for understanding deeply the impact of OD on lean transformations, Lean Sigma transformations. You know, why did a less structured approach work in my experience? There's tons of experiences out there. In my experience, a less structured approach actually had a better outcome. More structured approaches that I was exposed to fell short. I think and I'm not saying structured approaches are bad. I'm saying in these cases, I think it would be, it's good to dive into. So good opportunity for some Q&A and some pondering along there. So with that, Wes, I'll hand it back to you.
Yeah, and what we'd like you to do is write your questions if you haven't already in the chat space, and we'll start to answer them. And while you're writing some of those, keep in mind we have some resource links that we'll share with you and so forth about our program if you're not already familiar with it. And some of the objectives we had today, before we get into the questions, is really to differentiate organization development from organizational development. I hope you know the difference. That organization development is a facilitative bottoms-up approach to change. Recognize that to be successful, with an OD approach, it is appropriate. We're asking the people doing the job what they think. We just discussed a little bit about lean, the Six Sigma, the belts and so forth, and you had some more questions regarding that, but they're all continuous improvement tools. The tools are never going to go away. And of course, focusing your attention, if you want to improve your organization, looking at asking the right people, what are the pain points? What keeps them up at night? What project could potentially benefit from a lean approach? And of course, Dave shared some of his examples there, but I'm sure you have others that maybe you can share in the chat as well, that maybe you've undertaken as well. And with that, we'll start to address your questions. And I'll turn it back to Jenny.
So we do have a couple of questions here. So I'll get started. So the first question asks, how do I convince my leaders and associates to practice lean?
That's the $1 million question right there. It's a really good question. So in cases that I've been exposed to, where we have struggles with leadership understanding the value, I have seen success starting in a localized area. So applying some practices in an area and improving to a point where the improvements cannot be ignored, that they're obvious. This department is knocking it out of the park every day, every week, every month. They're solving problems. They're getting much more efficient than they used to be. That tends to garner some attention. And when leaders see benefit in helpful ways like that, then they tend to want to drive that to other places. And I've personally had some of that experience where I, had my little space of the world, and got to the point. In fact, that's what got me into Lean Six Sigma, or into the Six Sigma space, is I applied so many of the lean tools that I'd freed up about half my day. And they said, hey, you'd probably be pretty good at some of this Six Sigma stuff too. And so that opened up some opportunities. So that's where I would start.
I would agree with Dave on that. You know, it takes one person to use one lean tool correctly to illustrate results. Something as simple as 5S, the housekeeping, and getting rid of clutter and getting rid of waste. And all of a sudden you realize that by applying 5S, the housekeeping side of lean, you realize that you have an oil leak where you didn't realize that you had an oil leak before. And all of a sudden that leads to, well, gee, maybe that's why this gear is failing, or whatever the case may be. Or, you know, we went and we organized this area, and now we can find parts, and our time to repair something is cut in half because we're not searching forever for parts, or we're not reordering additional repair parts because we found the ones we had ordered the last time we had a repair. So just one person or one group of people applying lean tools can illustrate some results, and then passing them on. So if it's a crew leader and their crew that have achieved these results, then having the supervisor or the department manager see what was done, and then have the plant manager come out and see what was done. All of a sudden, you create at least an interest in, well, maybe we can try that someplace else, or maybe we can try it across the board, or whatever. It's you know, even the single minute exchange of dies, the SMED type process, where you organize your tools around a specific machine, things of that nature. They're all good tools to apply to achieve results and then create a following.
Well, and I'll add to that part of it also is from an OD approach, what are the pain points? Where is the organization feeling? What keeps them up at night? What are the pain points? And then looking for who really excited about doing something about it. Because you need, in an OD approach, you want some champions. You want to get some wins. So if you want to sell the philosophy to the upper leadership, at first, showing them here's people that are really interested in helping and improve the process, and then watch it happen. And you can even think of your own examples and so forth. But don't make it more difficult than it is. Leans, getting rid of waste, asking people their opinions of how to do things, and asking the experts, which are those doing the job.
Thank you. Another question is, can AI speed the lean OD process? If so, how?
Well, that's interesting, because when way back in the day, when we were first doing organization development, one of the comments we got from people was, well, if we're so messed up, can't we do anything right? Which was really kind of in a way asking the question, isn't there an AI approach to making change where we focus more on the things that we're doing right and leveraging that, as opposed to nitpicking at the things we're doing wrong? And so depending on the organization, certainly AI could play into it. AI is where you would go and say, okay, who are the exemplars? Who are the people within this organization that are doing things right, and what are they doing right? And what if we leverage what they're doing right across the organization or across the different shifts? We'd probably have better results. So there is an AI. Short answer is there is an AI approach to Lean Sigma.
And for those that may not understand what AI is, it's appreciative inquiry, at least in our business, looking for the good in people or the good in things. So it, as Eric said, it really does come into play.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Eric and Wes. And, in the practitioner space, and if you kind of look at the roots of lean and kind of the Japanese modeling, the focus wasn't really on what's going well. The focus was on, let's highlight, okay, the stuff that's going well, good. We don't have to pay attention to that. Let's work on solving problems. And probably one of the great quotes of coming out of the lean space was, no problem is big problem. And that came from some early Toyota work. So we focused on, and we continue to this day, and in my groups today, as we're doing our daily, weekly, monthly reporting of progress and how things are going, we're really focusing on where do we have gaps and how are we working to close those gaps. So it can surely lean towards that negative feel if the approach or the perspective is a problem is a bad thing, then that has a negative feel to it. So it does take a bit of maturity to get to the point where a problem is a good thing and we have skills to solve those problems. And so I do think there is some space for appreciative inquiry in there to help understand what's working well and how do we leverage that good aspect on solving challenges that we have.
Thank you.
Well, and in our chat box, Gail mentioned something about appreciative inquiry works well in engaging others in change efforts. Everybody loves to see that their results from what they did are being highlighted for others to look and follow and consider. And I would agree with what she's saying there.
Thank you. So we have another question. In addition to champions, what would be or has been your favorite resource to easily and quickly communicate the value of lean?
I'll do a real quick answer on that. The group of people that I like to tap into early in a process are those doubting Thomases, the people that really don't buy in, they don't drink the Kool-Aid kind of thing, and they're the hard sells. And what I found is if you work with them and you talk with them and you allow their challenge to be a request in disguise and answer that request, sometimes they become your greatest advocates, because it's the old Mikey cereal commercial. Look, Mikey's eating it. Everybody will like it. And so that group I like to tap into early.
Also looking at the data. I mean, we talk about Toyota, and of course you get so much PR and advertising and all that stuff. So what's really the facts? Well, I had an engineering group, and they did as a project. It was really an investment project, but they analyzed the different car companies. And it really blew me away, because when they looked at I don't know if man hours is politically correct anymore, but the man hours it takes to make a car. And Toyota, through a lean process, had streamlined how many chassis they had from where I think GM had 20 some. Toyota had 5. So you think about all the hassles, all the troubles they cleaned out of their process. Well, it really was astounding to me in black and white that the data showed Toyota was far better than their competitors when it came to the actual manpowers in an automobile. And there's a reason why they have less defects and so forth. So, it's the data. So I think looking for the data in your system, you hear people say whatever, but show me the data on it, and that'll talk.
Yeah, that definitely does. A couple of thoughts from my point. And Eric, you hit on, I call them the black swans in the organization, if you will, if you can get them. If you can get the lunchroom lawyers or the ones that are the influencers that have a high impact on the organization, and that doesn't mean they're leaders of position. If you can get a high influencer, especially a negative influencer, converted over to positive, you get the whole kit and caboodle. So now that's not easy, by the way. And I do a change leadership, change management piece at the Corey Academy conference each year on that. It's amazing how much feedback we get on that. I think another thing that will be very helpful, and one thing we did when I was in organization 2, we put together what we called win walls, or the journey wall. And so we allocated a piece of real estate wall in the office or in the factory or wherever the implementation was happening. And we would show teams would come up and put a very simple 8x10 that had before after pictures on it, and maybe just a few sentences of something that had changed. And then we would have that over time. And so we would have a year, and we would have kind of buckets per year, and you could walk past the journey wall and you could see that progress. And then it became real. And although there were small things happening throughout the process, it was as you looked at that whole picture, then that mosaic started to come together of the whole change. So that's an easy win that can be done.
Thank you. That's all the time that we have for questions. Back to you, Jenny.
Yes, thank you, Sagan. I'd like to thank Dr. Donahue and Dr. Bergstrom and Mr. Walker for sharing knowledge, expertise, and wisdom with us today. If we didn't get to your questions, please feel free to send us an email, or you can reach out to the presenters directly via email. On behalf of our OD&C program, we hope you found this webinar helpful. We would like to hear your feedback on our webinar series. Please take the survey using the link in the chat box. If you can't get the link, we will send it to you via email. Our next webinar is about virtual coaching to improve group relationships by Dr. William Rothwell and Dr. Cho-Yeon Park on August the 27th, Friday from 12 to 1 p.m. Registrations for all events can be found on all of our social media platforms. Thank you all for attending today, and see you in the next webinar. Thank you.